Welcome, traveler of time, to Sleepy Time History. Tonight, I invite you to leave the noise of the modern world behind. Unclench your jaw, relax your shoulders, and take a deep, slow breath in, and let it out. Tonight, we are sailing across the sea of centuries, to a place where the East meets the West. We are journeying to a city of gold and marble, a colossal empire that outlived its own death, standing as a solitary lighthouse in the darkest of ages. Close your eyes. Let the gentle winds of the Bosphorus guide your dreams as we uncover the beautiful, tragic, and eternal story of the Byzantine Empire. Prologue. The miracle on the Bosphorus. Stop scrolling for a moment. Let me tell you a story. Imagine an empire that should have died a dozen times over, plagued by civil wars, betrayed by allies, devastated by pandemics, and surrounded by enemies on all sides. Yet somehow, against all logic, it survived for 1,100 years. It wasn't a sudden upstart. It was the ancient Roman Empire, the same one that once conquered the Mediterranean, getting a second life after everyone had already written its obituary. Many call it the Byzantine Empire, but its people, they had a different name for themselves. Until the very end, they called themselves what they had always been, Romans. Tonight, we're not going to bore you with dry dates and forgotten battles. We're going to tell you the story of how this stubborn, impossible empire somehow kept getting knocked down and kept getting back up for over a millennium. This is the story of Byzantium. This is the story of Rome's second act. Chapter 1. The Great Relocation, 330 AD. Every great story needs a turning point. For the Eastern Roman Empire, that moment came in the early 4th century, thanks to one man with an audacious vision, Constantine the Great. Picture the Roman Empire in 300 AD as a massive corporation that had been in business for centuries, but was now on the verge of bankruptcy. The executives were fighting each other, the employees weren't getting paid, and barbarian competitors were circling like vultures. The headquarters in Rome was a mess. Traffic-choked streets, skyrocketing real estate prices, and worst of all, it was hopelessly far from the wealthy eastern provinces where the real money was made. Constantine looked at this disaster and made a decision that would change history. He didn't just renovate, he didn't downsize, he did something far more radical. He moved the entire headquarters. But Constantine didn't pick just any location. He chose a small Greek fishing village called Byzantium, sitting at the narrow strait between Europe and Asia. This spot was, quite simply, perfect. It controlled the Bosphorus Strait, the gateway between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. Ships from Europe could dock on one side. Caravans from the Silk Road arrived on the other. If real estate agents had existed back then, they would have been screaming. Waterfront property with built-in fortifications, once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. In 330 AD, Constantine officially inaugurated his new capital. He called it Nova Roma, New Rome, but the people had a different name for it. They called it Constantinople. This wasn't just a relocation. This was open-heart surgery on a dying patient. Constantine understood something crucial. The old Roman religion, the pantheon of Jupiter, Mars, and Venus, had lost its power to unite people. Everyone was worshipping different gods, and society was fracturing like ice on a warm spring day. So Constantine made a decision that would have made his ancestors spin in their graves. He legalized Christianity. After the Edict of Milan in 313 AD, Christianity went from an underground movement to the official religion of the empire. This was a masterstroke. Constantine realized that instead of having people worship dozens of squabbling gods, he could have them worship one god, and that god's representative on earth. That would be the emperor himself. One god, one empire, one emperor. This became the core algorithm that kept Byzantium alive for 1,000 years. The old Roman aristocrats grumbled that Constantine had abandoned the ancestral city to go play with the Greeks. But Constantine was too busy stripping the entire empire of its finest art treasures to decorate his new capital. He even had the bronze columns from the Temple of Apollo at Delphi torn down and shipped to Constantinople. On the day of the dedication, the wind off the Golden Horn caught the imperial purple banners. Constantine stood on the walls, watching his magnificent city rise below him. He couldn't have known that he had just launched a story that would last 1,000 years. This wasn't the birth of a new nation. This was Rome 2.0. Chapter 2. The Great Divorce, 395 AD. If Constantine gave the Roman Empire a new brain, then Theodosius I gave it the final push toward its transformation. Theodosius was a tough, uncompromising Spanish general who earned the title the Great. But his most famous decision wasn't a military conquest, it was something far more consequential. On his deathbed in 395 AD, Theodosius looked at his two sons Arcadius and Honorius and made a choice that would echo through history. He divided the empire between them. Think about this for a moment. Imagine you are the CEO of a massive multinational corporation. In the morning, you are dealing with worker strikes in Rome. By noon, you are rushing to the Danube to stop barbarian invasions. By evening, you are in Constantinople, reviewing tax reports from Egypt. This wasn't governing. This was being a human battery, draining yourself until there was nothing left. Theodosius sighed and split the company. Arcadius got the East, Constantinople, Egypt, Syria, and Asia Minor. These were the wealthy provinces, the empire's breadbasket and its commercial heart. The tax revenue flowed like water, and the bureaucracy ran like a well-oiled machine. Honorius got the West, Italy, Gaul, Spain, and North Africa. These were the provinces being torn apart by barbarian invasions. The aristocracy was corrupt, the tax system was collapsing, and the army was more loyal to its generals than to any emperor. It was the worst kind of inheritance. One brother got the family fortune, the other got the family debts. The separation was more than geographical. Within decades, the two halves evolved into completely different civilizations. In the East, Arcadius, weak as he was, had a professional bureaucracy behind him. His officials weren't obsessed with military glory. They focused on diplomacy, trade regulation, and religious law. Constantinople became a Greek-speaking Christian empire with a highly centralized government. In the West, Honorius was a disaster. Legend has it that when a messenger told him Rome has fallen, he panicked because he thought they meant his pet chicken named Roma. This wasn't just a divorce, it was the beginning of two completely different destinies. The Eastern Romans quickly realized something crucial. As long as they held the impregnable walls of Constantinople, the chaos outside didn't have to destroy them. They could watch their Western brothers drown and still keep their own heads above water. When barbarian armies swept through Italy, Gaul, and Spain, the emperors in Constantinople sent strongly worded letters, maybe a few token soldiers. They had their own problems. The Sassanid Persians were always threatening from the east. This was survival logic at its coldest. The East had saved itself by cutting loose the dead weight of the West, but they would carry the memory of that abandonment forever. Chapter 3, The Last Roman in the West, 476 AD. The year 476 AD is one of those dates that every history student memorizes, and for good reason. That was the year the Western Roman Empire officially ceased to exist. The barbarian general Odoacer marched into Ravenna, looked at the teenage puppet emperor Romulus Augustulus, and basically said, "Kid, give me the crown. I am sending it to Constantinople. We don't need emperors in the West anymore. I'll just be a governor under the Eastern Emperor." And so, in one of history's most surreal moments, the symbols of Roman imperial power, the crown, the purple cloak, the imperial regalia were packed up and shipped east like a UPS package. When the Eastern Emperor Zeno opened that box, his feelings must have been complicated. Imagine your brother losing his entire inheritance and mailing you the deed to the family house with a note that says, "I sold everything to scavengers." Good luck. This was the moment Byzantium entered survivor mode. Let's paint a picture of the world in 476 AD. Western Europe was a disaster zone. The Vandals were tearing apart North Africa. The Visigoths were carving out a kingdom in Spain. The Franks were taking over Gaul. The magnificent Roman roads were overgrown with weeds. The grand marble bath houses had been turned into stables. And in Constantinople, people were arguing about chariot racing in the hippodrome, sipping wine spiced with expensive Eastern spices, completely unbothered. This contrast explains everything about why the East survived. The West collapsed because it was rotten to the core, mercenary armies that had no loyalty, a tax system that had completely broken down, and a landed aristocracy that had gobbled up all the small farms. The East had two things the West didn't. First, the Theodosian walls. These were the most sophisticated fortifications in the ancient world, 3 layers of defense, with deep moats and towering battlements. When Attila the Hun, the man who had terrorized all of Europe, arrived at Constantinople's walls, he took one look, rode around for a bit, and then muttered, "This is impossible." He went west instead. Second, a ruthlessly efficient tax bureaucracy. While Western emperors couldn't even pay their own guards, Eastern emperors had a steady stream of revenue that could fund armies, build monuments, and bribe enemies. But survival came at a psychological cost. The Eastern Romans began to see themselves as the chosen people, the only true Romans left. They watched the West fall not with sadness, but with a strange sense of vindication. God had punished the impure Romans. Now Constantinople was the only legitimate heir. This attitude would define Byzantine identity for the next 1,000 years. Chapter 4. The Dream of Restoration, 527 to 565 AD. In 527 AD, a new emperor ascended to the throne who would change everything. His name was Justinian I, and he was without question one of the most driven, ambitious, and obsessive rulers in human history. Justinian was born a peasant in the Balkans. Through sheer determination and the influence of his uncle, he rose to the purple throne. But he never forgot where he came from, and he never stopped dreaming of something greater. Justinian had 3 pillars of support. First, his general Belisarius, one of the greatest military commanders in history, who could win battles with impossibly small armies. Second, his legal team, a group of brilliant jurists who would compile the laws of Rome into the most influential legal code ever created. Third, his wife, Theodora, a former actress, and possibly much more, who became the most powerful empress in Roman history. She was tougher than Justinian himself. Let's start with the law. Justinian was obsessed with order. He couldn't stand that Roman law had become a chaotic mess of contradictory rulings accumulated over centuries, so he ordered a complete overhaul. The result was the Corpus Juris Civilis, the Justinian Code. This wasn't just paperwork. This was the foundation of Western law. The concepts of justice, property rights, and legal procedure that we take for granted today. They were codified here. Justinian wanted to prove that Rome's greatness wasn't just about conquest. It was about civilization. But law wasn't enough. Justinian had a more audacious goal. He wanted to restore the Roman Empire to its ancient glory. He launched what can only be described as a military miracle. Belisarius, with shockingly small forces, conquered North Africa from the Vandals in a lightning campaign. Then he turned north to Italy, determined to retake Rome itself. For a brief, shining moment, it worked. The Mediterranean was once again a Roman lake. Italy, North Africa, and southern Spain all flew the imperial banners. In Constantinople, people walked with their noses in the air. Look at those barbarians in the West. We can take back everything whenever we want. To match this glory, Justinian commissioned the greatest building project in Christian history, the Hagia Sophia. He hired the finest mathematicians and architects. When the massive dome seemed to float above the worshippers, Justinian reportedly exclaimed, "Solomon, I have surpassed you." But this golden age had cracks running through its foundation. First, the Nika riots of 532. Justinian's heavy taxation had pushed the people too far. When a massive riot threatened to overthrow him, Justinian prepared to flee. It was Theodora who stopped him with the most famous words ever spoken by a Roman empress: "Purple makes an excellent shroud." In other words, die like an emperor or run like a coward. The choice is yours. Justinian chose to stay. He ordered Belisarius to massacre the rioters in the Hippodrome. 30,000 people were killed in a single day. The throne was saved, but the bond between emperor and people was broken forever. Second, the cost. These conquests emptied the treasury. To pay for them, Justinian's tax officials squeezed the population until they had nothing left to give. Farmers abandoned their land. The economy began to strangulate. Justinian was like a gambler on a winning streak who didn't know when to stop. He had reconquered the West, but who would farm the land? Who would pay taxes? Who would defend these territories from the Germanic tribes that still roamed the countryside? And then, in 541 AD, came the blow that no one could have predicted. Chapter 5. The Invisible Enemy, 541 to 542 AD. Justinian was still riding high on his dreams of restoration. He had reconquered Italy, North Africa, and parts of Spain. He had built the Hagia Sophia. If history had stopped here, he would have been remembered as the greatest Roman emperor since Augustus. But history doesn't care about human plans. In 541 AD, a tiny stowaway arrived in Constantinople, a flea carrying the bacteria that causes bubonic plague. This was the plague of Justinian, the first recorded pandemic in human history. It traveled along the very trade networks that made Constantinople rich, arriving on grain ships from Egypt. What happened next was apocalyptic. At its peak, 10,000 people were dying every day in Constantinople. The streets that had once hosted triumphal parades were now piled with corpses. The towers of the city walls were filled with bodies. The smell of death hung over everything. Justinian himself caught the disease. For days he lay in his bed, delirious with fever, the telltale swellings in his groin and armpits. Theodora held the government together by sheer force of will. But here's the thing that made this catastrophe even worse. Justinian survived. And he didn't change. You might think that a near-death experience would make an emperor reconsider his priorities, maybe pause the wars, maybe give the people a break. But Justinian emerged from his sickbed with the same obsessive drive. His armies were still in the field, his building projects were still underway, and he needed money. So he implemented something monstrous: collective tax liability. If a village had lost half its population to plague, the survivors had to pay not just their own taxes, but the taxes of their dead neighbors. This wasn't reconstruction. This was economic murder. Farmers looked at their abandoned fields and the tax collectors' hungry faces, and they made a rational choice. They fled. They became serfs on large estates. They disappeared into the mountains. The imperial tax base, the foundation of everything, collapsed. And the enemies noticed. The Sassanid Persians, seeing that Constantinople was crippled, tore up their peace treaties and invaded. They sacked the great city of Antioch. In Italy, the Goths launched a furious counterattack. Justinian, paranoid that Belisarius was becoming too powerful, recalled his greatest general and sent second-rate commanders to Italy. The reconquered territories turned into killing fields. By the time Justinian died in 565 AD, he had ruled for 38 years. He had reconquered the Mediterranean. He had built monuments that still stand today. He had codified the laws that would shape Western civilization. But he had also emptied the treasury, devastated the population, and pushed every institution to the breaking point. He thought he was restoring Rome. In reality, he was spending the last coins in Rome's inheritance. Chapter 6. The blood loss 630s minus 640s AD. By the early 7th century, the Eastern Roman Empire was running on fumes. Justinian's wars had drained the treasury. The plague had emptied the cities. The old Roman world was fading into memory, and then came the final blow. For centuries, the empire had fought the Sassanid Persians in a series of brutal wars. In the 620s, Emperor Heraclius launched a desperate counterattack. He emptied the churches of their treasures, gathered every soldier he could find, and marched east. Against all odds, he won. The Persian Empire collapsed. Heraclius returned to Constantinople as a savior. The people cheered. It seemed like a new dawn. But it wasn't a dawn. It was a sunset. Because while Rome and Persia had spent centuries bleeding each other white, something new had arisen in the Arabian desert. The Islamic Caliphate, united under a new faith. Arab armies exploded out of the peninsula with a speed and ferocity that no one had ever seen. They didn't just want to raid, they wanted to conquer, convert, and rule. In 636 AD, at the Battle of Yarmouk, the Eastern Roman army met the Arab forces in a showdown that would determine the fate of the Middle East. The Romans had heavy infantry and armored cavalry, the same forces that had conquered the Mediterranean. But the Arabs had light cavalry that moved like the wind, striking and vanishing before the Romans could respond. The result was a catastrophe. When Heraclius heard the news, he looked out at the Levant, the provinces he had just fought so hard to reclaim, and whispered, "Farewell, Syria." And then came the worst blow of all. Egypt fell. Egypt wasn't just another province. Egypt was the empire's breadbasket. For centuries, grain ships had sailed from Alexandria to Constantinople, feeding 1 million people. Without Egyptian grain, the capital starved. Without Egyptian tax revenue, the government couldn't pay its soldiers. In a few short decades, the Eastern Roman Empire lost 2/3 of its territory. The empire that had once spanned 3 continents was now reduced to Anatolia and scattered holdings in the Balkans. This wasn't just a military defeat. This was an existential transformation. The empire that emerged from this catastrophe was fundamentally different from the one that had entered it. The Latin-speaking Mediterranean-focused, classical Roman state was dead. What replaced it was smaller, poorer, Greek-speaking, and fighting for its very survival. But and this is crucial, it did survive, and in survival, it transformed. Chapter 7. The transformation 7th–8th centuries AD. After the Arab conquests, the Eastern Roman Empire faced a simple choice: adapt or die. The old system was broken. The empire couldn't afford professional armies anymore. The tax base had collapsed. The great cities were shrinking. Something radical needed to change, and it did. The solution was called the theme system, and it was revolutionary. Here is how it worked. Instead of paying soldiers in cash, which the empire didn't have, the government paid them in land. Soldiers were settled in military districts called themes. In peacetime, they were farmers, growing their own food. When war came, they grabbed their weapons and defended their own homes. This was brilliant. The empire transformed defense from an expensive commodity into a civic duty. Every theme became a self-sustaining military unit. The soldiers weren't fighting for a distant emperor. They were fighting for their own farms, their own families, their own soil. Along with this military revolution came a cultural one. Latin died. For 1,000 years, Latin had been the language of Roman law and administration. But now, Emperor Heraclius made it official. The title of the emperor changed from the Latin imperator to the Greek basileus. Government documents were written in Greek. The empire was no longer pretending to be the old Roman Republic. It was becoming something new. A Greek Christian empire centered on Constantinople, ruled by an emperor who was both head of state and God's representative on earth. But this transformation wasn't smooth. It came with a violent internal struggle called the iconoclasm controversy. The crisis started with a simple question: why was the empire suffering so much? Why were the Arabs winning? Some emperors decided the answer was idolatry. The Byzantines had filled their churches with icons, images of Christ, the Virgin Mary, and the saints. Maybe God was angry. Maybe these images violated the commandment against graven images. So a series of emperors launched a campaign to destroy the icons. They sent soldiers into churches to smash mosaics, whitewash frescoes, and melt down sacred images. It was a cultural catastrophe, but it was also a power play. By attacking the icons, the emperors were asserting control over the church. The emperor wasn't just a secular ruler, he was the defender of the faith, with authority over religious doctrine. The controversy tore society apart. Monks hid icons in caves, families were divided, riots erupted. But in the end, the imperial state emerged stronger. The emperor had proven that he could reshape the spiritual life of his people. By the end of the 8th century, the Eastern Roman Empire, now thoroughly transformed, had stabilized. It was smaller, poorer, and more homogeneous than the old Roman Empire. But it was also tougher, more cohesive, and more resilient. It had learned the most important lesson in survival: when the world changes, you must change with it. Chapter 8. The Golden Age, 867 to 1025 AD. If the Roman Empire had been a patient in intensive care for centuries, then in the late 9th century, something remarkable happened. It got up, it walked out of the hospital, and it started flexing its muscles. This period is known as the Macedonian Renaissance, and it was one of the greatest revivals in history. The dynasty was founded by a man named Basil I, and his origin story sounds like something from a Hollywood movie. Basil started as a stable boy, shoveling manure in the imperial stables. He was tall, strong, and charming. He caught the eye of the emperor, rose through the ranks, and eventually seized the throne himself. From these humble beginnings came 2 centuries of glory. Militarily, the empire went on the offensive. For centuries, the Byzantines had been playing defense, holding the walls, praying for survival. Now they started pushing back. They reconquered Crete, Cyprus, and parts of Syria. The Mediterranean, which had been lost for centuries, was once again a Roman lake. The greatest warrior emperor was Basil II, known to history as the Bulgar Slayer. Basil was a workaholic who never married, never took vacations, and spent his entire life on campaign. His signature achievement was the conquest of Bulgaria, a powerful kingdom that had threatened Constantinople for centuries. At the Battle of Claudion in 1014, Basil crushed the Bulgarian army. Then he did something so brutal it echoes through history. He captured 15,000 prisoners and blinded 99 out of every 100 men. The survivors, each with one eye left, were sent back to their king. When the Bulgarian Tsar saw his army of blind men stumbling home, he collapsed from grief and died. Bulgaria never threatened Byzantium again. Economically, the empire flourished. The theme system was working. Farmers were productive. Trade routes were secure. The treasury was so full of gold that emperors had to build new vaults to store it all. Culturally, this was a renaissance. Scholars in Constantinople copied and preserved ancient Greek texts that would otherwise have been lost forever. Artists created masterpieces of ivory, enamel, and mosaic. The university in Constantinople became a center of learning that attracted students from across the Christian world. Foreign ambassadors who visited the imperial palace were dazzled by what they saw. The throne room featured mechanical lions that roared and birds that sang automata designed to awe visitors with the sophistication of Roman technology. The emperor, elevated on his throne, seemed like a figure from another world, half man, half divine. For a brief moment, it seemed like the Roman Empire had returned to its ancient glory, but appearances can be deceiving. Chapter 9. The Slow Rot, 1025 to 1071 AD. When Basil II died in 1025, the empire was at its peak. The treasury overflowed. The borders were secure. The enemies were cowed. But if you could have X-rayed the empire, you would have seen something troubling. The bones were rotting. The theme system, the foundation of Byzantine military power, was being undermined from within. During the long peace of the Macedonian dynasty, powerful aristocrats had started buying up the land of small farmers. The free peasant soldiers who had defended the empire for centuries were being reduced to serfs. And here is why that mattered. A serf doesn't fight for his land. A serf has no land to fight for. The imperial government tried to stop this. Basil II had been ruthless in punishing aristocrats who seized peasant land. But after his death, the emperors who followed were weak men, more interested in palace intrigues than in governing. The aristocrats won. The free peasantry disappeared. Without a reliable native army, the empire made a fateful decision. It started hiring mercenaries. Normans, Varangians, Turks. These soldiers had no loyalty to Rome. They fought for pay, and if someone else offered more, they switched sides. This was the beginning of the end. Meanwhile, a new power was rising in the east, the Seljuk Turks. The Seljuks were a Turkic nomadic people who had converted to Islam and swept through Persia and into Anatolia. They were fierce horsemen who could outrun and outmaneuver the heavy Byzantine cavalry. In 1071, the empire made a desperate gamble. Emperor Romanos VIII Diogenes marched east with the largest army the empire could muster, determined to crush the Seljuks once and for all. The result was the Battle of Manzikert, and it was a catastrophe. The Byzantine army was destroyed. The emperor himself was captured, the first Roman emperor in history to become a prisoner of war. But the military defeat wasn't the worst part. The worst part was what happened next, the Civil War. When news of the defeat reached Constantinople, the political factions didn't rally to save the empire. Instead, they launched a coup against the captive emperor's family. Generals turned on each other. The Seljuks, watching from the sidelines, walked into Anatolia almost unopposed. Within a decade, the empire had lost Anatolia, its heartland, its breadbasket, its recruiting ground. The empire that had survived Persians, Arabs, and Bulgars was now being carved up by its own dysfunction. Chapter 10. The Betrayal 1204 AD. Of all the disasters in Byzantine history, none was more devastating or more shameful than what happened in 1204. The story begins with the Fourth Crusade. The Crusaders' knights from France, Flanders, and Italy had originally planned to sail to Egypt and then march on Jerusalem to liberate the Holy City from Muslim control. But they had a problem. They couldn't afford the ships. Enter Enrico Dandolo, the Doge of Venice. He was nearly 100 years old, blind, and absolutely ruthless. He made the Crusaders an offer. Instead of going to Egypt, come with us to Constantinople. There is a young prince there who needs help reclaiming his throne. He is promised to pay you more money than you've ever seen. The Crusaders agreed. They sailed to Constantinople, put the young prince on the throne, and waited for payment. But the prince couldn't pay. The imperial treasury was empty. He started melting down church treasures, stripping the ornaments from the Hagia Sophia itself. The people of Constantinople rioted. The prince was murdered. A new emperor took the throne and told the Crusaders, "There is no money, go home." Dandolo made his decision. He told the Crusaders, "If the emperor won't pay, we'll take payment ourselves." On the 12th of April 1204, the Crusaders breached the walls of Constantinople. What followed was one of the darkest chapters in Christian history. Soldiers wearing the cross of Christ sacked the greatest Christian city in the world. They tore the jewels from the altars of the Hagia Sophia. They smashed ancient icons. They burned libraries full of irreplaceable manuscripts. They set prostitutes on the patriarch's throne. For 3 days, the city burned. The Crusaders didn't just loot the city, they dismantled the empire. They set up a Latin empire with a French knight as emperor. Venice took the islands and ports. The Byzantine government fled to Nicaea across the Sea of Marmara and established a government in exile. This wasn't conquest. This was murder. The empire that had survived for nearly 9 centuries had been destroyed, not by Muslims, not by pagans, but by fellow Christians. It would take 57 years for the Byzantines to reclaim their capital. But when they did, they found a city in ruins. The population had collapsed. The palaces were empty shells. The great works of art were gone. The empire that returned to Constantinople in 1261 was a shadow of what had been. It was no longer an empire. It was a city-state with delusions of grandeur. Chapter 11. The Long Twilight, 1261 to 1453 AD. When Michael VIII Palaiologos rode back into Constantinople in 1261, he must have felt like a man returning to a house that had been stripped by thieves. The walls were still standing. The Hagia Sophia was still there, but everything of value was gone. The great palaces were leaking. The mosaics had been torn from the walls. The lead had been stripped from the roofs and sold. The crown jewels were in Venetian pawnshops. The empire's most sacred relic, the crown of thorns, had been sold to the King of France. This wasn't a restoration. This was a funeral. The empire that Michael VIII ruled was a tiny fragment of what it had been. Constantinople and its surroundings. A few outposts in Greece. That was it. The emperors of the Palaiologos dynasty became masters of a desperate art, survival diplomacy. They played every side against every other. They promised to reunify the Orthodox and Catholic churches in exchange for Western military support, a promise they couldn't keep even if they wanted to. They married their daughters to Turkish sultans and Mongol khans. They hired Catalan mercenaries and then tried to avoid paying them. It was a humiliating existence for the heirs of Caesar and Constantine. But even in this decline, something remarkable happened. The Palaiologan Renaissance was a final flowering of Byzantine culture. Scholars copied and studied ancient texts. Artists created some of the most beautiful frescoes and mosaics in Christian history. The churches of Constantinople, stripped of their gold, were filled with a quieter kind of beauty. It was a Renaissance born of desperation, like a candle flaring brightest just before it goes out. The empire was dying, and everyone knew it. The only question was, when would the final blow fall? Chapter 12, The Last Stand, 1453 AD. The year was 1453. The place was Constantinople, and the story was about to reach its end. Outside the walls, a young and brilliant sultan named Mehmed II had assembled the largest army the city had ever faced. 80,000 men, including the elite Janissary Corps, and something new, massive cannons that could smash stone walls that had stood for 1,000 years. Inside the walls, the last Roman emperor, Constantine Palaiologos, had fewer than 8,000 defenders. Many were foreign volunteers, Genoese, Venetians, a small band of Catalan mercenaries. They knew they were probably going to die. They stayed anyway. Mehmed II brought a Hungarian engineer named Urban, who cast the largest cannon the world had ever seen. It was over 8 meters long. When it fired, the recoil knocked down the walls behind it. but the stone balls it hurled could smash through the Theodosian walls, the same walls that had stopped Attila the Hun and countless others. Day after day, the bombardment continued. The defenders repaired the walls at night. They prayed in the Hagia Sophia. They knew that no help was coming. Mehmed offered Constantine a deal: surrender, and you can rule a small province in Greece. Keep your title. Keep your life. Constantine's answer has echoed through history. To surrender the city is not my right, nor that of any of its inhabitants. We have all decided to die with our freedom, and we will not regret our decision. This wasn't a politician negotiating. This was a Roman emperor drawing a line in the sand. On the night of May 28, 1453, a final service was held in the Hagia Sophia. Orthodox and Catholic worshippers, who had excommunicated each other for centuries, prayed together. The emperor received communion for the last time. He rode out to the walls to join his soldiers. At dawn, on May 29, the final assault began. The Ottomans attacked in wave after wave. The defenders held for a while, but exhaustion and overwhelming numbers took their toll. And then, in one of those accidents that change history, someone noticed a small postern gate that had been left open. Ottoman soldiers poured through. The defenses collapsed. When the cry went up that the city had fallen, Constantine did something extraordinary. He tore off his imperial regalia, the purple cloak, the jewels, the symbols of 1,000 years of power. He drew his sword, and he charged into the thickest fighting. He was never seen again. Some say his body was found among the dead, unrecognizable. Others say he was turned to marble and waits beneath the city to return when his people need him. But the truth is simpler. The Roman Empire died with him. When Mehmed II rode into the Hagia Sophia, he ordered the cross removed from the dome. In its place, the crescent of Islam was raised. Constantinople became Istanbul. The empire that had begun with Augustus in 27 BC, that had been reborn in Constantinople in 330 AD, that had survived for 1,480 years, that empire was gone. Epilogue, the legacy. So what was it all for? An empire that spent 1,000 years in slow decline. An empire that was conquered, reconquered, sacked, and finally extinguished. An empire that ended with a lone emperor charging into certain death. Was it worth it? Here is the thing about the Byzantine Empire. It kept the light burning. While Western Europe descended into the Dark Ages, Constantinople preserved the heritage of ancient Greece and Rome. The texts of Homer, Plato, and Aristotle survived because Byzantine monks copied them by hand, generation after generation. Roman law, the foundation of justice in the modern world, was preserved and refined in Constantinople. When the empire fell, thousands of scholars fled west, carrying their books and their knowledge. They landed in Italy, where they helped spark the Renaissance. The Byzantine Empire was the bridge between the ancient world and the modern world. It was the guardian of civilization during the darkest centuries of human history. And it was something else, too. It was a story of stubbornness. The Byzantines refused to die. They adapted, transformed, reinvented themselves. They switched from Latin to Greek. They changed their army, their economy, their society. They did whatever it took to survive. And through it all, they never forgot who they were. They called themselves Romans until the very end. Not because they were delusional, but because they understood that being Roman wasn't about speaking Latin or living in Italy. It was about carrying a torch. It was about believing that civilization was worth preserving. It was about refusing to let the lights go out. That empire is gone now, but the light it carried, that light is still burning. It is burning in the laws we use, in the books we read, in the ideas we take for granted. The Byzantines lost their empire, but they won something more important. They kept the flame alive long enough for the rest of the world to find it. Closing thoughts. History is often told as a story of winners and losers. Empires rise, empires fall, and the world moves on. But sometimes, the real story isn't about who won. It is about what survived. The Byzantine Empire lost its territory, its wealth, and ultimately its existence. But it gave us something immeasurable. It kept the heritage of the ancient world alive through 1,000 years of darkness. Without Byzantium, there would have been no Renaissance. Without the Renaissance, there would have been no modern world. Every time you read a Greek philosopher, every time you see a court of law, every time you look at a piece of Renaissance art, you are looking at the legacy of an empire that refused to die. So the next time you think about history, remember, the story isn't over when an empire falls. Sometimes that is when the real story begins. If you enjoyed this journey through 1,000 years of history, please hit that like button and subscribe. We have many more stories to tell, from the rise and fall of empires to the forgotten corners of human civilization. Drop a comment below. What aspect of Byzantine history fascinated you the most? The walls that defied armies, the emperors who refused to surrender, or the scholars who preserved ancient wisdom against all odds? And here is something to think about. In our own time, what are the walls we're building? What knowledge are we preserving for future generations? What will survive of our civilization 1,000 years from now? History isn't just about the past. It is about the questions we ask ourselves today. Thank you for watching. Until next time, keep wondering, keep questioning, and remember, every civilization is one generation away from being forgotten. Good night, and may your dreams be as enduring as the walls of Constantinople.